A recent initiative out of the Archdiocese of Baltimore reveals the frightening ideology behind the progressive push to reform the sacraments in the interest of accompaniment. As reported by America magazine, the Archdiocese of Baltimore has scrapped the long-standing rule that Catholic marriage celebrations take place within Catholic churches. This change opens the door to weddings at beaches, golf courses, private residences, and every other venue the creativity of man can concoct. The change was initiated on an experimental basis in 2018, and it has recently been announced that the change will now be permanent. But what was the rationale behind the decision? America Magazine's review of the matter begins with an example of what it considers a common pastoral problem faced by engaged couples. Quote, Ben and Catherine Volker wanted a Catholic wedding, but they faced a logistical challenge. Their reception, to be held at Baltimore's American Visionary Arts Museum, was slated to take place late in the day, and the only option for a church ceremony would have left their guests with several hours of downtime. Unsure what to do, the couple remembered attending another wedding at a nearby hotel. Even though the ceremony was outside a church, the priest had served as the celebrant. Perhaps their ceremony could also be held at their venue, while maintaining the religious components that were so important to them. Thankfully, the Volkers did not have to deal with the trauma of making their guests wait a few hours between events, as the Archdiocese's new rule allowed them to solemnize their marriage at the museum. Mrs. Volker said that it was important that their marriage be sacramental in nature. She expressed gratitude that the diocese, quote, let us have the timeline for the day that we wanted while still preserving the Catholic aspect, which was important to us. As is the case throughout the Western world, the number of Catholic weddings is dropping in Baltimore, with many baptized Catholics opting for secular ad hoc ceremonies at outdoor venues, where they can craft the details of the ceremony according to their whims, from the location right down to the vows themselves. Seeing this trend, the authorities of the Archdiocese began to wonder whether they could change this downward trajectory if they permitted these outdoor weddings. Now, the Code of Canon Law, Canon 1115, says marriages are to be celebrated in a parish where either of the contracting parties resides or at least has lived for a month. It does, however, say that marriages can be celebrated elsewhere with the permission of the ordinary, essentially leaving the matter to the discretion of the bishop. Despite this allowance, the vast majority of U.S. dioceses have demonstrated a conservative tendency in the matter, preferring to retain the tradition of restricting marriage ceremonies to the church itself. Baltimore's new policy makes it only one of very few U.S. dioceses to buck the trend. The America article tellingly writes that the change was due to a push from only a handful of priests, represented in the article by Father Stephen Hook. Father Hook says he supported the change because young Catholics seemed disconnected and disenfranchised. Even those brought up in the church were opting for non-Catholic ceremonies, he noted. Many of these couples never even bothered to call the church to inquire about a ceremony. They simply chose a secular wedding by default. What is the mentality of these people? Another quote from Father Hook is telling. Quote, Father Hook said he heard of couples who were not opposed to a Catholic wedding, but who preferred to exchange vows outdoors, perhaps along the nearby Chesapeake Bay, at a beloved family home, or even in the same venue that would host the reception. He felt the church was losing an opportunity to engage with these couples, end quote. Are couples who are not opposed to receiving a sacrament properly disposed to do so? What if during your child's first communion interview, your pastor asked if your son was excited to receive Jesus, and your child said, I'm not opposed to it? What if a penitent in the confessional said, well, I'm certainly not opposed to confessing my sins? Would not this attitude reflect a profound immaturity concerning the sacrament? An appalling lack of proper disposition? If the one deciding factor between a sacramental marriage and an invalid one is the venue, what does it say about these people's conception of matrimony? Such couples certainly need evangelization, but not by affirming their deformed view of the sacrament. The entire thing is an exercise in legal legerdemain. Can't stop people from getting married contrary to custom? Well, legalize the abuse, and discipline has been restored. It's right out of the playbook that gave us communion in the hand, and its results on the integrity of the sacrament of matrimony will be no better. But Diocesan Chancellor Diane Barr thinks otherwise. Couples are enthusiastic about the change, she says. One of the key benefits? It grants couples greater flexibility when planning what could be a stressful day. What's the problem here? It's still a valid marriage. Obviously, matrimony can be celebrated outside the church, but this was always restricted to extraordinary circumstances. Just like Mass can be celebrated outside the church, or baptism can be administered outside the church. But such things have never been the norm. Matrimony is a sacrament of the church. It is not meant to exist in isolation, reduced to mere validity. Like all sacraments, it is meant to be ensconced within a rich tapestry of liturgical rites, signifying its mystical realities. I mean, for goodness sake, the union of man and woman typifies the union of Jesus Christ with the church. Receiving the sacrament inside the church before the altar where the sacrifice of the Mass is offered is the optimal place for a marriage to be solemnized. Reducing the celebration of a sacrament to mere validity is a distorted, minimalist approach to the liturgy. People who say such things understand neither sacraments nor the liturgical structure they occur within. What has happened is the laity have gradually assumed control over the administration of matrimony, wresting it away from the church and prying it free from its traditional liturgical context. It has ceased to be considered a sacrament and is primarily considered as the property of the couple, their special day, to be carried out according to their direction. Are people who view matrimony in such a manner suitably disposed to be married in the church? Another pastor interviewed in the America piece, Father Joshua Laws, reports that the first thing couples want to discuss when they begin marriage prep is the venue. Not the sacrament, not counseling on building a healthy marriage, but the venue. Father Laws reported that a full 50% of his weddings celebrated each year now happen outdoors. A further occasion for grief is that these outdoor weddings occur not only outside of the church, but outside of the Mass. Diocesan guidelines stipulate that weddings outside the church must be a wedding without the Mass. Thus, everyone who chooses this option is deprived of the graces of a matrimonial Mass. Even now, it is possible to be married within a church without a Mass, but with outside weddings, it is mandatory. 50% of marriages officiated by Father Laws occurred without the benefits of the Mass. Father Laws said couples trying to navigate faith complexities with family and friends might not want to hold their wedding inside a church. The opportunity to have a sacramental marriage elsewhere can alleviate anxieties. There are a ton of people who just don't feel comfortable in church buildings for a lot of reasons, he said. So couples choose to get married outside of the church building, thinking it's going to be more welcoming to all of their guests. In other words, non-Catholics or nominal Catholics may feel uncomfortable about setting foot inside a church. Therefore, the church will abandon its traditional sacramental structure in order to be welcoming. The article goes on to relate how priests have succeeded in bringing families back to the church from engaging them at outdoor weddings. Again, Father Laws, quote, "Sometimes seeing a priest at a non-traditional wedding site, at least in terms of the Catholic Church, prompts guests to reconsider their views. My experience has been that it helps people who are on the fence about having a Catholic wedding at least reconsider it. Because I think one of the narratives out there is that the church is just bogged down with rules and obligations. A priest's presence challenges those notions and encourages people to give the church another look." If the presence of a priest outside of church is so powerful, why not also mandate priests going out in public to wear their clerics? This would undoubtedly accomplish the same thing on a much broader scale without having to deviate from the church's traditional way of celebrating marriage. Father Laws goes on to say that outdoor marriages he celebrated, and I quote, have felt sacramental, whether because of the natural beauty the witness couples provide to the passerby, or simply the ability to incorporate into the wedding a place special to the couple, end quote. Now, you might have noticed that absent in all of this is any discussion of the graces of matrimony, the mystical meaning of the sacrament, the Church's intention when it officiates at the sacrament, or the symbolism of the rite. The things that should come first are entirely neglected. If one were to ask these people what is the liturgical setting for the sacrament of marriage, we get the impression they would have no concrete answer beyond the bare minimum for sacramental validity, all the rest being lost in an amorphous fog of options. Well then, what is the priority in these kind of ceremonies? Going back to the article, quote, Father Laws remembers one wedding held at a hotel situated at the city's inner harbor, with the water and skyline providing a stunning backdrop to the wedding of two Baltimore natives. They really loved the city, and they wanted their wedding to be a kind of way of blessing Baltimore, Father Laws recalled. As we're listening to scripture readings, listening to them exchange vows, you look out and you see the whole city right there. It just made sense. Let us conclude this study with a final quote, returning to the Volkers. For Catherine and Ben Volker, whose wedding was celebrated by Father Laws in 2021, the opportunity to preserve the Catholic elements of the wedding ceremony, as Catherine put it, while successfully confronting logistical challenges, made their wedding all the more special. And that is how Father Laws sees the impact of the policy change. We're adding to the richness of the sacrament of marriage, Father Laws said. This is just adding to the beauty of it. What kind of thinking is this? This trip into the heartland of novelty may have left you with a bad aftertaste. Let's clear our palate by looking at a picture of Blessed Pius IX. Whew, okay, that's better. Now let's step back and consider this initiative as a case study in accompaniment. I'm going to give the pastors interviewed the benefit of the doubt and assume that they have the best motives. Father Stephen Hook has a blog that I've looked at, and from what I can tell, he seems like a well-intentioned priest who just had some bad liturgical formation. Father Josh Laws is a younger priest who also seems genuine in his concern to reach the peripheries. Both priests hope that Baltimore's changes will ultimately bring souls back to the church. There is, however, a hierarchy of goods. In the celebration of a sacrament, the primary goods to be sought are the glorification of God and the sanctification of the one receiving the sacrament. We've heard a lot here about considering matrimony as an evangelistic event, an opportunity to reach the unchurched. Now, even if that is true, that is not the primary end of the sacrament, which is the formation of the indissoluble bond of the spouses with all the accompanying graces. This good is hardly mentioned at all. When the spouses are considered, it is from perspectives that are purely worldly, lessening the stress of wedding planning, giving them a beautiful backdrop for their ceremony, making logistics easy for their guests. The sacramental good of the rite is entirely subordinated to the aim of evangelism, where norms are jettisoned in favor of exceptions. And when exceptions become the norms, there are no longer norms. When everyone is super, no one will be. We see this trend also in contemporary discussions about the liturgy, communion for the divorced and civilly remarried, and ordination of women. Everything, discipline, theology, liturgy, mysticism, must take a back seat to evangelism. Going to the peripheries justifies the complete deconstruction of every other aspect of Catholic tradition. It is literally sawing off the branch one sits upon, spending a quarter to make a nickel, cutting off your nose to spite your face, and every other metaphor to denote a massive sacrifice for a meager return. Which ironically means these evangelistic efforts are undermined from the get-go. If we are so desperate to fill the pews with warm bodies that we are willing to eviscerate the rite of all its symbolism so that couples who aren't opposed to a Catholic wedding can say their vows on a beach, what are we even bringing them back to? What else can be said, save to quote Jeremiah, the weeping prophet? My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water.